Hi and welcome back to the channel. About 22 years ago I went to a press conference in Melbourne Town Hall, down in the cheap seats in Melbourne Town Hall, with a first-time movie director who was also a fairly well-known actor. And it was a very small press conference. There were like 10 people there. This guy got really big afterwards, but at the time he was kind of known but not enormously famous. And one of the things I heard him say at the press conference before he went around and said hello to everybody was that cinema is a very young art form. It's only a bit more than 100 years old, 125 years old, 126 these days. And the people who do it are still learning the vocabulary and learning to optimize the way cinema works. They're learning the grammar and vocabulary and the world of telling stories in this particular way. At the end of the video, I'm going to tell you who that guy was, but that one thing stuck with me. One of the things I thought about while I was watching this movie, about which I'm going to speak, is that idea of learning how to make movies of a particular genre. Now, horror as a genre has gone through a hell of a lot of changes in the last 100 years. We've gone from this to the Saw franchise, and that's a long century of scaring people in various ways, and people have become desensitized to certain kinds of horror. People have grown used to certain kinds of horror. There's torture porn, which I'm not particularly a fan of. There's suspenseful horror, there's creeping horror, there's dread. Thrillers have a certain horror aspect to them as well. So it's good to kind of see where some movie that's part of the way along that continuum change things. That first movie to show certain things and to create the genre of body horror. Which movie was that? It was this one from 1960, directed by Georges Franju, and it's called Eyes Without a Face, Les Yeux Sans Visage. And it's great. It has a beauty and a horror to it, and a combination of those two things which is unique in cinema. Now, Franju started out making documentaries. He made short films that were, in a little sense, art house documentaries. He did a short video called Blood of the Beast, which was about horses being slaughtered in an abattoir in Paris. And yet he's got a couple of shots in there that are extremely beautiful. He really was a one-off. He made another movie in 1963 based on an old movie serial and an old magazine serial called Judex. And you should check that one out as well. It's a magical film in its own way. But Eyes Without a Face is something special because it is the first time that I can think of where body horror really was an important theme in a movie. The story starts out really simply and draws you in. There's a woman played by Alida Valli who is, her name's Louise, and she's driving a small car through the night out on the outskirts of Paris. Alida Valli, you might remember, was the woman who was Harry Lime's girlfriend in The Third Man. And she's driving, and there's a slumped figure wearing a large hat in the back seat of her car. And she then pulls over on the banks of the River Seine in a very deserted area and drags a woman's body out of the back seat of the car and dumps it in the river. Now, this was kind of shocking for the time because women didn't usually dispose of bodies in movies. There was usually a guy, and usually they'd just throw it into a pit full of alligators or a pit of acid or something like that. But this one was a little bit different because we knew Alida Valli from previous movies, and yet here she was doing something really reprehensible. And as the movie unfolds, she turns out to be the secretary/lover of Professor Genesio. Professor Genesio is an expert on transplants, particularly skin transplants. And we see him giving a lecture in a very prestigious establishment in Paris about the possibility of transplanting skin from one person to another. He gives a very knowledgeable and a very kind of up-to-date scientific analysis of it, as the science was in 1960. And so he goes home and we see that his basement is full of dogs, and we know that he's experimenting doing skin transplants on dogs, because I suppose it's easier to do a skin transplant on a dog than on a guinea pig. We also see Genesio with his daughter, Christiane, played by Ida Scob, who wears a porcelain mask. Genesio had a car accident, his wife died in it, and his daughter's face was disfigured. And ever since then, Genesio has been trying to do face transplants to successfully treat the disfiguration of his daughter's face. And to do those face transplants, he needs live subjects. And so he and Louise are kidnapping young women who fit a certain look, anaesthetising them and ripping their faces off, basically, and transplanting them onto Christiane. Christiane's an interesting figure. Genesio has arranged for one of the bodies he chucks into the Seine to be identified as her, so she's legally dead. And she keeps getting her hopes up that one of these transplants is going to work. And every time that he transplants another face onto hers, eventually it rots on her face. And we see that quite interestingly and quite graphically as the movie progresses. And the creepy thing is that Genesio sees his daughter as a means for him to be successful in his career. If he nails the transplant technique, he is going to be incredibly well regarded in his business. And he doesn't seem to care very much the effects this is having on his daughter, who has to lie on the benches while an anaesthetised woman next to him has her face ripped off. And she is kind of gaslighted by him and Louise into accepting this situation. Now, before the accident, she did have a fiancé who was a doctor, and she keeps calling the doctor up but not saying anything on the phone. She just wants to hear her fiancé's voice. And as played by Edith Scobb, she's a tragic figure. She's slim and graceful, and Edith Scobb does a lot with just her eyes and her physical movements to give us a beautiful and ethereal woman trapped in a nightmare. You can look at it from a 21st century feminist perspective about coercive control and abuse, and they're very valid ways of looking at this movie. It's not me just tacking on buzzwords to display what's going on. It's very much, we now have a vocabulary to explain what happens to this character in this movie. Well, the police are, of course, investigating these murders and don't seem to be getting anywhere. And it's only when eventually Christiane says her fiancé's name, I think it's Jacques, on the phone, and he realises that she's not dead and she's still alive, that things start to unfold for Genesio and Louise. And it's only when there's a delay in one of the operations that Christiane can kind of get some agency and take control and stop this nightmare from happening to people. And the movie ends on some beautiful looking scenes, even though this is a horror movie, and even though one of the characters gets ripped apart by dogs. It's shot in a beautiful lyrical way in these final scenes, and that makes it an incredibly beautiful movie. The music by Maurice Jarre is very good in this one as well. It starts out in a kind of strident kind of organ music, but then flows into the movie as we learn more and more about what's happening in the film. The graphic scenes, the scenes of transplants and the scenes of horror are lingering. There's done in a couple of takes, because obviously you can't really peel the face off a woman, but the operation is shown in, for 1960, very graphic detail of removing the face from a young woman. And even though the makeup technology isn't anywhere as adept as it would be these days, it's still quite confronting for a movie of this vintage. And the camera is looking down upon it in an almost documentary way, which just enhances the horror. The horror in this movie creeps up on you. It builds brick by brick. It's not just slammed at you. There's no jump scares in this. There's none of that. It's a slow realization of the character situations and the monstrousness of those situations that really makes this work, and doesn't look like the kind of guy who would do these sorts of things. Alida Valli is very good as Louise, who is a very willing co-conspirator with Genesio, and who does most of the kind of scut work and the dirty work, and luring them into becoming subjects for his operations. It's really a deeply creepy movie. And it's been an influential one too. A lot of the body horror stuff that we've got subsequent to this, including a lot of the work of people like Jess Franco, and also some Filipino horror movies of various types, were influenced by this. It really is an important film in the history of horror cinema. And if you haven't seen it, you should now. I've got the BFI edition, and BFI are doing so much good stuff, and this one I got about 4 years ago. That's the one you need to look for. It's got a few of the short films that Franju made as well. There's The First Night, about a 10-year-old boy spending a night on the metro trains. There's one about Mr. and Mrs. Curie, so Marie Curie and her husband. And there's a documentary about Franju himself. So this one's really great. If you can get the DVD version, it's also got Blood of the Beast in it, which is a much gorier movie than anything, because it's a documentary about slitting the throats of horses in an abattoir. And it is a very hard watch, but it does have that weird combination of horror and beauty for which Franju was very well known. So that's about it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you've seen Eyes Without a Face. I'll put a link in the description to the Amazon site where you can buy it, and I get a bit of a Amazon associate bump if you do. But it really is a movie that people should watch and have, because if you like horror of any kind, it's always good to see where it came from. And Franju had the guts to show us a really scary, really beautiful, and really graphic horror movie for 1960. So anyway, take care of yourselves. Get the jab if you can. And if you put a post in here saying don't get the jab, I'm going to remove it. Watch some good movies. Watch some bad movies. Watch French horror movies. They are going to surprise the shit out of you. And I'll catch you next time. By the way, the person who gave that press conference in Melbourne in 1998 was Kevin Spacey. Even assholes can have profound things to say sometimes. So I'm going to give the Patreon supporters their credits now and leave you with some footage of our brand new kitten, Luna, whom we got yesterday and who is cuter than anything on the earth. See you next time.